The old aluminum boat slid off the trailer with a familiar, gentle scrape, its hull kissing the surface of Lake Oakhaven just as the sun began its slow burn through the morning mist. For Arthur Vance, this was more than a routine, it was a ritual, a silent conversation with the ghosts of better days. At 52, with hands calloused from 2 decades as an Army combat engineer and a face weathered by suns in places far from this quiet Missouri shore, Arthur moved with a deliberate economy of motion. He secured the trailer, his breath pluming in the cool air, and allowed himself a small, rare smile. This place, this water, it was the only thing that had ever truly felt like his. His father had taught him to fish on this very lake, back when it was just a stretch of wild water surrounded by unnamed woods, long before the first stone of the Mayfield Landing luxury community was ever laid. He'd bought the entire parcel, the lake, the shoreline, and 50 acres of the surrounding woods, with every penny he'd saved, a quiet monument to the man who taught him that the best things in life weren't owned, but respected. He was just reaching for his thermos of black coffee when a new sound cut through the stillness. It wasn't the call of a loon or the rustle of deer in the underbrush. It was the high-pitched, electric whine of a golf cart, driven far too fast down the gravel path that led to the boat launch. It stopped with an aggressive halt, kicking up a small cloud of dust. A woman emerged, dressed in tennis whites that seemed almost blindingly bright in the soft morning light. She wore oversized sunglasses, held a phone to her ear with one hand and a clipboard in the other. She radiated an aura of frantic, self-important energy that felt like a direct assault on the morning's peace. She ended her call with a sharp, "I'll handle it," and marched toward him, her pristine white sneakers crunching on the gravel like grinding teeth. Arthur stood by his truck, hands resting loosely on his hips, and waited. He'd seen her type before, in committee meetings and on bases around the world, people who confused authority with power. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You can't be here." Arthur gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Morning." Her eyes, hidden behind the dark lenses, scanned his old but reliable Ford F-150, lingered on the faded decal of the Army Corps of Engineers on the back window, and finally settled on his simple, unpretentious fishing boat with a look of undisguised disdain. "This is a private launch," she stated, not asked. "This entire lake is for the exclusive use of Mayfield Landing residents and their registered guests. You need to pack up your things and leave." Arthur took a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. "Didn't see a sign," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that offered no hint of confrontation. "The sign is posted at the main gate," she snapped, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on her clipboard. "Ignorance of community bylaws is not an excuse for trespassing. I'm Carol Atherton, president of the Homeowners Association." She announced the title as if expecting a salute. "And you are?" "Arthur Vance." Her pen scratched his name onto a sheet on the clipboard. The motion was aggressive, accusatory. "Well, Mr. Vance, your boat isn't on the approved vessel registry. Your vehicle isn't registered with our security office. You are in violation of at least half a dozen HOA covenants." There was a particular way she said, "your boat," a subtle curl of her lip that suggested it was something dredged up from the bottom of the lake rather than a vessel he'd spent years maintaining. He felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his gut, the kind of quiet anger he'd learned to control long ago. He recognized her gaze instantly. It was a look that didn't see a man, but a problem to be removed, a stereotype to be managed. "I've used this launch before," he said, keeping his tone perfectly level. "Never been an issue." "Then you've been lucky," she retorted, her voice dripping with condescension. "We've had a significant problem with unauthorized locals using our facilities. Leaving trash, causing noise, it compromises the integrity of the community." Arthur's eyes swept along the shoreline, noting 2 overflowing trash cans and a discarded plastic chair near the reeds, evidence of the fishing club's last tournament. He chose not to mention it. Instead, he looked directly at her. "I'm just here to fish. I won't cause any trouble." Carol Atherton actually let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Oh, I'm sure you won't. Because you're leaving. Now. She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a tone of theatrical patience, as if explaining a complex concept to a simple-minded child. Look, I don't know where you normally fish, but this lake is part of a multi-million-dollar master-planned community. We have standards. We have rules. They are here to protect our property values and ensure our residents can enjoy their amenities in peace. Your presence here disrupts that. He looked past her, at the glassy surface of the water his father had loved. He thought of the quiet promise he'd made to himself when he signed the deed, to be a steward, a guardian of this place. That promise didn't involve being run off his own land by a woman with a clipboard and a superiority complex. He decided to give her one chance, a single opportunity to reconsider her position. Ma'am, he began, his voice still quiet but now laced with a new firmness. I would strongly advise you to get back in your golf cart and take a closer look at the county records for this parcel of land. I think you'll find you're operating under a significant misunderstanding. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. It was quickly replaced by indignation. Are you threatening me? I am the president of this HOA. I know exactly who owns what in this community. Do you? Arthur asked softly. The simple question seemed to infuriate her more than any shout could have. I do, she seethed. And I am telling you, for the last time, to remove your property from these premises. If you refuse, I will have our security escort you out. If you resist them, I will call the sheriff and have you charged with criminal trespass. Is that clear enough for you? Arthur held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave another slow nod, turned his back to her, and stepped into his boat. Carol gasped, outraged. What do you think you're doing? I just told you to leave. Arthur didn't look at her. He picked up an oar and pushed off from the shore, the boat gliding silently into the deeper water. You do what you feel you have to do, he called back over his shoulder, his voice carrying clearly across the water. I'm going fishing. Carol Atherton stood on the shore, her mouth agape, watching the small boat move with infuriating calmness toward the center of the lake. The sheer audacity of it sent a hot surge of rage through her. This had never happened before. Her authority in Mayfield Landing was absolute, a finely tuned instrument she used to orchestrate every aspect of community life, from the approved shades of beige for exterior paint to the seasonal flower arrangements at the front gate. The system worked because people, especially people like him, understood the unspoken rules. They knew their place. Arthur Vance, however, was not playing by her rules. He was, in fact, ignoring them entirely. She jabbed at her phone, her fingers trembling with fury. Get me Mark, she commanded the person who answered. I don't care if he's on patrol, get him on the radio. Now. A moment later, she was speaking, her voice a clipped, weaponized version of itself. Mark, it's Carol Atherton. I have a trespasser at the boat launch. Yes, right now. He's non-compliant and has taken his boat onto the lake. I want him removed. Immediately. She paused, listening. I don't know, some older black man. His name is Arthur Vance. He's operating an unregistered vessel and is being incredibly hostile. The lie slid out easily, a necessary embellishment to ensure the response she wanted. Just get down here. And you know what? Call the sheriff's department. I want to press charges. This is exactly the kind of element we've been trying to keep out. She hung up, a grim smile of satisfaction on her face. Let him fish. He could explain himself to a deputy. Meanwhile, out on the water, Arthur felt the last vestiges of his morning peace evaporate. The confrontation hadn't just been an annoyance, it had been a violation. It dredged up memories he preferred to keep buried, of being followed in stores, of having his credentials questioned on job sites, of the 1,000 tiny cuts that life had dealt him. He had built a life on the principles of discipline and control, learned in the unforgiving environment of the military. He didn't lose his temper. He assessed, he planned, and he acted. And as he looked at the shoreline, at the faint glint of sunlight off the tacky vinyl siding of the monstrous houses that crowded the water's edge, he knew this was no longer a simple matter of being left alone. Carol Atherton wasn't just a rude woman, she was a symptom of the disease that had infected his sanctuary. He'd seen it for months. The beer cans left in the reeds, the tangled fishing line that was a death trap for birds, the faint, iridescent sheen of oil on the water near the main dock where the fishing club members used oversized motors on their bass boats, a clear violation of the environmental covenants he'd established. He had allowed the HOA's fishing club continued access to the lake when he bought it, a gesture of goodwill. The agreement, inherited from the previous owner, was simple: the club could use the lake in exchange for acting as its caretakers, for maintaining the shoreline and respecting the rules. It was a contract they had flagrantly ignored. He reeled in his line, his decision made. This wasn't just about her disrespect. It was about theirs. His father had treated this lake like a church. These people were treating it like a private sewer. The whine of the golf cart returned, this time accompanied by a white pickup truck with the Mayfield Landing Security logo on the side. A young man in a stiff uniform got out. He looked barely old enough to shave. Carol immediately began pointing, her gestures sharp and frantic. The security guard, a kid named Dave, approached the water's edge, his hand resting uncertainly on his hip. "Sir," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, in the boat. I'm going to have to ask you to come ashore." Arthur turned the boat so he was facing them. He was perhaps 50 yards out. "Are you a law enforcement officer?" he called back, his voice calm and clear. Dave hesitated, glancing at Carol, who was now glaring at him. "No, sir. I'm with community security." "Then I'm afraid I'll have to decline your request," Arthur replied, his tone polite but firm. "I'm on private property, and I have no intention of coming ashore." "It's not your property," Carol shrieked from behind the guard. "This is community property, and you are trespassing." Dave looked deeply uncomfortable. He was a part-time college student who'd taken this job for the steady hours. His training manual had a chapter on de-escalation, and yelling across the water at a man who seemed considerably calmer than his own boss felt like the opposite of that. "Sir," he tried again, "Mrs. Atherton has filed a complaint. We just need you to come in so we can sort this out." "There's nothing to sort out," Arthur said. "Mrs. Atherton has made her position clear. She said she was calling the sheriff. I'll be happy to speak with them when they arrive. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop disturbing the peace." He turned his attention back to his fishing rod, a clear dismissal. The finality of the gesture was not lost on Dave, or on Carol. Her face was a mask of pure fury. She stormed over to the young guard. "What are you doing? Go get him. Use the community paddle boat if you have to. Don't just stand there and let him disrespect you." "Ma'am, I can't physically force him to come ashore," Dave said, his voice low. "That would be assault. We have to wait for the deputies. That's the protocol." "You work for us," she hissed. "Your protocol is what I say it is." But Dave held his ground, his gaze fixed on the man in the boat who seemed utterly unconcerned, a small island of tranquility in the storm of her making. To Carol, this was an intolerable breakdown of the natural order. The world she had so carefully constructed, a world that bent to her will, was being defied by a man in a rusty old boat. And then, in the distance, a new sound began to slice through the morning air. It was faint at first, but growing steadily louder. A siren. A satisfied, vindictive smile spread across Carol Atherton's face. The real authorities were coming. The game was over. For Arthur, however, it was just beginning. He reeled in his line, laid the rod down gently, and waited. The patrol car, a crisp black and white Ford Explorer, rolled to a stop next to Carol's golf cart. Two deputies from the Greene County Sheriff's Department stepped out. The senior officer, a man with graying temples and a calm, methodical air named Miller, took in the scene with a practiced eye: the expensive houses, the agitated woman in white, the young security guard who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and the lone man in the boat, now sitting motionless, watching them. His younger partner, Evans, was already flipping open his notepad. Carol descended upon them like a hawk on a field mouse. "Thank God you're here, Deputy," she began, her voice a pitch higher than usual, laced with a carefully curated blend of fear and indignation. "This man, Arthur Vance, has been trespassing on our community's private lake. I repeatedly asked him to leave, and he became incredibly belligerent. He refused to comply with our security officer and has been verbally threatening. We want him charged to the fullest extent of the law." Deputy Miller listened patiently, his expression giving nothing away. He'd handled calls in Mayfield Landing before. They usually involved disputes over lawn ornaments or unapproved mailbox colors. A belligerent, trespassing fisherman was a new one. He looked past her toward the boat. "And that's him out there?" "Yes," Carol confirmed, pointing dramatically. "He thinks he can just ignore our rules. He has no right to be here." Miller nodded slowly, his gaze still on Arthur. The man in the boat didn't look belligerent. He looked patient. "All right, ma'am. Let's calm down and we'll figure this out." He walked to the edge of the water, his boots stopping just short of the damp soil. "Sir," he called out, his voice a calm but authoritative baritone. "I'm Deputy Miller with the Greene County Sheriff's Department. I need you to come ashore so I can have a word with you." Out on the water, Arthur picked up his paddle. He gave no argument, no protest. He simply began paddling toward the small dock with smooth, efficient strokes. The sight of his immediate, quiet compliance seemed to deflate Carol's narrative of a hostile intruder. He was not acting like a man who was cornered, he was acting like a man who was coming to a meeting he had scheduled. He secured the boat to a cleat on the dock and stepped out, his movements steady and sure. He was taller than Miller by a few inches, with a straight-backed posture that spoke of his military past. He faced the two deputies, pointedly ignoring Carol and the security guard. "Deputies," he said, his voice even. "What can I do for you?" "We've received a complaint of trespassing, sir," Miller said. "This is private property belonging to the Mayfield Landing Homeowners Association." "Is that so?" Arthur replied, his tone genuinely curious. It wasn't the response of a guilty man. It was the response of a man questioning a faulty premise. Carol, unable to remain silent, stepped forward. "Yes, that's so. We own this entire development." "Tell him, Deputy." Miller held up a hand to silence her, his eyes still on Arthur. "I'm going to need to see some identification, sir." "Of course," Arthur said. He reached into his back pocket and produced a worn leather wallet, from which he extracted his driver's license. Miller took it, examining the name, Arthur M. Vance, and the address, a rural route number just a few miles away. Everything appeared to be in order. "Mr. Vance," Miller said, handing the license back. "Can you tell me what you're doing here today?" "I'm fishing," Arthur said simply. "This is a private lake, sir," Evans, the younger deputy, interjected, reading from the notes he'd taken from Carol's statement. "Access is restricted to residents." "I'm aware of the access agreement," Arthur said. The choice of words, agreement, not rule, was subtle but significant. It caught Miller's attention. "So you're a guest of a resident?" he asked. "No, I'm not," Arthur stated calmly. "Then you are trespassing," Carol exclaimed, her voice rising again. "This is ridiculous. Why are you even talking to him? Arrest him." Miller turned his head slightly, his gaze on Carol now cold. "Ma'am, I need you to let me handle this. One more outburst and I'm going to ask you to wait in your golf cart." Carol's mouth snapped shut, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. The deputy had just reprimanded her in front of the trespasser. The world was tilting off its axis. Miller turned back to Arthur. "Mr. Vance, if you're not a resident and you're not a guest, on what authority are you on this property? Arthur met his gaze without blinking. On the authority of ownership. A stunned silence fell over the small group. Dave the security guard's eyes went wide. Evans fumbled with his pen. Carol let out a sound somewhere between a scoff and a choke. That is the most absurd, pathetic lie I have ever heard, she spat. He's a squatter, a con man. He probably lives in a shack down the road and thinks he can intimidate us. Arthur didn't even glance at her. He kept his focus entirely on the senior deputy, recognizing him as the only person here whose opinion mattered. Deputy, he said, I can assure you, it's not a lie. The deed for this parcel, number 3-7-7A, which includes the entirety of Lake Oakhaven and the surrounding 50 acres of undeveloped woodland, is held by a private trust. Miller's eyebrows raised slightly. This was far more complex than he'd anticipated. Trespassing was simple. Land trust disputes were a civil nightmare. And what's the name of this trust? He asked, his tone shifting from that of a cop on a simple call to that of an investigator. Arthur allowed a very faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. It's called the Oakhaven Heritage Trust, he said. And I'm its sole trustee. Carol laughed, a shrill, ugly sound. A trust? How convenient. You can't prove any of that. I don't have to, Arthur said, turning his head to finally look at her. For the first time, he let her see the cold, hard certainty in his eyes. But they can. He nodded toward the deputies. Miller looked at his partner. Evans, run the parcel number with the county recorder. And run the name Oakhaven Heritage Trust with the Secretary of State's office. Evans nodded, already moving toward the patrol car and its computer. The air was thick with tension. The power dynamic had been completely upended. Carol Atherton, who had summoned the law to bend to her will, was now forced to stand by and watch as that same law began to methodically dismantle her entire world. Her authority had vanished, replaced by a terrible, dawning uncertainty. She watched the younger deputy tap at his keyboard, her heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. The few minutes it took for Deputy Evans to walk to his car and back felt like an eternity. The air on the dock was thick and still, broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the frantic, shallow breathing of Carol Atherton. She stood with her arms crossed, her knuckles white, her gaze darting between the patrol car and Arthur, who seemed content to study the water lapping against the pilings. He looked, she thought with a fresh wave of indignation, completely unbothered. It was the calm of a man who knew the outcome, a man who had set a trap and was now patiently watching it spring. Evans returned, a piece of paper in his hand. He avoided looking at Carol and spoke directly to his partner. Well, I'll be, he said, more to himself than to Miller. It's all here. Parcel 3-7-7A, Lake Oakhaven and environs. Purchased 3 years ago by the Oakhaven Heritage Trust. Secretary of State's office confirms the trust is in good standing. The sole registered agent and trustee is listed as Arthur M. Vance. The address on file matches the one on his driver's license. The words fell like hammer blows into the quiet morning. Each fact was another nail in the coffin of Carol's authority. Deputy Miller took the paper, glanced at it, and then looked at Arthur with a newfound respect. He handed it back to Evans. That settles that, then, he said. Carol stared, her face a canvas of disbelief. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. The developers, the community documents, this lake is ours. It's the centerpiece of Mayfield Landing. According to the county and the state, it isn't, ma'am, Miller said, his tone now devoid of any of its earlier patience. This man legally owns the ground you're standing on. There must be a mistake. A clerical error, she insisted, her voice growing shrill. Our HOA has managed this lake for 15 years. Arthur decided it was time to end her confusion. Your HOA didn't manage it, he corrected her, his voice cutting cleanly through her panic. They had a conditional use agreement with the previous owner, a courtesy that I, as the new owner, chose to extend. He walked to his truck, opened the passenger door, and pulled a thick, waterproof folder from the glove compartment. He walked back and opened it on the hood of the truck. "This, Deputy," he said, inviting Miller over, "is a copy of that agreement. Please note Section 4, subsection B, regarding environmental stewardship. It explicitly forbids the use of two-stroke motors and requires all refuse to be removed by the club. I've personally documented 16 separate violations of that subsection in the last year alone." He flipped a page. "And here, Section 6, maintenance. The fishing club is responsible for the upkeep of the dock, the launch, and the shoreline refuse containers. As you can see," he gestured to a loose board on the dock and the overflowing bins, "they are derelict in their duties." He turned one final page, his finger landing on the very last clause. "But most importantly, Deputy, is this final paragraph. The agreement is subject to annual renewal, requiring a formal request from the HOA to the trust 60 days prior to expiration. The original agreement expired 2 months ago. No renewal request was ever submitted." Carol stared at the papers, her mind refusing to process the information. She had been so focused on policing who was allowed in, she'd completely neglected the legal paperwork that granted them permission in the first place. It was a staggering, catastrophic failure of her oversight. Miller finished reading the highlighted sections and looked up, his face grim. He knew a legal checkmate when he saw one. He turned to Carol. "Ma'am, not only is Mr. Vance the legal owner of this property, but it appears your HOA's agreement to use it is no longer valid. You and your members are, in fact, the ones who are trespassing." The reversal was so total, so absolute, that Carol felt the world physically tilt. The trespasser was her. She was the one who didn't belong. The security guard, Dave, looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. Miller gave Arthur a nod. "Mr. Vance, I apologize for the intrusion. We were responding to a call. As far as I'm concerned, there's no criminal issue here for you to worry about." He then fixed Carol with a hard stare. "We don't take kindly to being called out for no reason, Mrs. Atherton. Filing a false report is a serious offense. I suggest you think carefully before you dial 911 again." Arthur held up a hand. "No need for that, Deputy. Mrs. Atherton was simply misinformed. But now that we're all clear on the facts, I do have a statement to make, and I'd appreciate it if you and your partner would serve as witnesses." Miller gestured for him to proceed. Arthur turned to face Carol directly. His voice was not angry, not triumphant, but as cold and clear as the lake water itself. "Effective immediately, due to the multiple and ongoing breaches of the now expired contract, any and all previous permissions granted to the Mayfield Landing Homeowners Association and its affiliated fishing club to access Lake Oakhaven are hereby permanently revoked." He then looked at Dave. "That goes for your security patrols as well. You are to inform your residents that as of this moment, this is private property. Any member of the HOA or their guests found on this land, on this dock, or on this lake will be prosecuted for criminal trespass. I will be posting official signage within the hour." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Mrs. Atherton," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "I believe your golf cart is parked on my property. I suggest you move it." With a final nod to the deputies, Arthur turned away, his business with them concluded. Miller and Evans tipped their hats and walked back to their patrol car, leaving Carol Atherton standing on the dock, utterly humiliated. The authority she had wielded like a weapon had been stripped from her, broken down and exposed as a complete illusion. She looked at Arthur, who was now calmly beginning to prep his fishing line, a man entirely at peace in his own world, a world she had just been violently ejected from. The sound of the sheriff's car driving away was the sound of her defeat. The news of Carol Atherton's humiliation spread through Mayfield Landing not like a wildfire, but like a chemical spill, silent, toxic, and affecting everything it touched. It did not, however, spread as a story of her own making. By the time she had driven her golf cart back to the pristine, beige clubhouse, her narrative had been forged into a weapon. She convened an emergency meeting of the HOA board, her voice trembling with a performance of righteous victimhood. She spoke of a hostile, aggressive stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. She described his refusal to cooperate, his verbal threats, and then, the masterstroke of his villainy, a legal loophole, a dusty, forgotten clause in some obscure paperwork that he had maliciously exploited to seize the lake from the heart of their community. She conveniently omitted her own aggressive confrontation, the expired contract, the multiple documented violations, and the fact that she had been the one to call the sheriff on the actual landowner. In Carol's telling, Arthur Vance was not a man defending his property, he was a corporate raider in a fishing vest, a predator who had stolen their most precious jewel. The board, composed of men and women accustomed to her iron-fisted leadership, reacted with predictable outrage. The fishing club president, a portly man named Don, slammed his fist on the conference table. "This is unacceptable. My members pay their dues. We have a right to that lake." Another board member, a woman who ran the social committee, lamented the loss of the annual 4th of July pontoon parade. The outrage was born of pure, undiluted entitlement. For 15 years, they had treated the lake as their own private resort, a right that came with their oversized mortgages. The idea that it belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't one of them, who didn't live behind their gates, was not just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental violation of their worldview. While they fumed and plotted, Arthur was at work. He drove his old F-150 to the local hardware store and bought 3 dozen 9x12-inch aluminum signs and a box of heavy-duty zip ties. For the next 3 hours, he walked the entire 2-mile perimeter of his property. At every point where a neighborhood path or backyard touched his land, he methodically fastened a sign to a tree or fence post. The message was simple, printed in bold, uncompromising red letters: private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. He wasn't angry as he worked. He felt a quiet, resolute calm. Each sign was a reaffirmation of the promise he'd made to his father's memory, a physical barrier against the carelessness and arrogance that had tried to invade his sanctuary. He was simply and quietly reclaiming what was his. The signs appeared like metallic sores on the manicured landscape of Mayfield Landing. Residents on their evening walk stopped and stared, pointing and whispering. The act was seen not as a legal precaution, but as an act of war. The story of the hostile stranger was now visibly, tangibly real. Not everyone, however, was swept up in the collective hysteria. In a quiet house on the far side of the development lived George Maxwell, a retired corporate lawyer in his late 70s. George had served one term on the HOA board years ago and had resigned in disgust at Carol's petty tyranny. When he heard the story, a garbled, third-hand account from his panicked neighbor, his legal mind immediately sensed that key facts were missing. Carol's version didn't add up. That evening, George sat down in his study, opened his laptop, and began to dig. It took him less than 30 minutes on the Greene County Public Records portal to find everything. He saw the deed transfer to the Oakhaven Heritage Trust. He saw Arthur Vance's name. He then cross-referenced the parcel with the original development blueprints for Mayfield Landing, which he still had saved on a hard drive. Just as he'd always suspected, the lake had never been part of the community's initial property portfolio. It had always been separate, a fact the developers had likely downplayed to enhance the value of the homes. Then he found the smoking gun. He logged into the HOA's own online document archive, a poorly organized digital closet that Carol rarely touched. Buried in a folder from 15 years ago, he found the original scanned copy of the conditional use agreement. He read it twice. He saw the clauses on maintenance and environmental care. He saw the clear, unambiguous requirement for annual renewal. His legal training allowed him to see the situation not through a lens of emotion and entitlement, but with the cold, hard clarity of contract law. Carol hadn't been wronged, she had been negligent. The HOA hadn't been robbed, they had forfeited their privileges through sheer incompetence. Arthur Vance wasn't a villain, he was a landowner who had been pushed, and was now exercising his legal rights. George leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating a grim expression on his face. He felt a profound sense of disgust. Carol was whipping the entire community into a frenzy, potentially leading them toward a costly and unwinnable legal battle, all to cover for her own failure. She was willing to demonize a man she didn't know to save her own skin. He thought about Arthur Vance, a man he'd never met. He imagined the scene at the boat launch, the quiet dignity it must have taken to stand firm in the face of Carol Atherton's venom. He thought about what was right. He could stay silent, let the drama play out, and enjoy the schadenfreude of Carol's inevitable public downfall. Or he could intervene. He could speak the truth. He closed his laptop and walked over to the window, looking out at the darkened street. He had spent 40 years of his life navigating the complexities of right and wrong, of law and ethics. He knew that silence in the face of a lie was a form of consent. He picked up his phone and looked up the public listing for the Oakhaven Heritage Trust. He found the registered agent's contact information. He hesitated for only a moment before dialing the number. It was time the truth had an ally. Arthur was sitting on his porch, the scent of cut grass hanging in the humid evening air, when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He was wary, expecting another misinformed, angry resident, but the voice on the other end was calm and measured. "Is this Mr. Arthur Vance?" it asked. "My name is George Maxwell. I'm a resident of Mayfield Landing, and I believe you and I need to talk." Arthur listened, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a profound sense of surprise as George, in the precise, economical language of a seasoned lawyer, laid out the facts he had uncovered. He spoke of the deed, the original development plans, and the expired agreement he had found in the HOA's own archives. "Mrs. Atherton is not telling the community the truth, Mr. Vance," George concluded, his voice heavy with disappointment. "She is manufacturing a crisis to conceal her own professional negligence. I cannot, in good conscience, stand by and watch that happen." This call was the first crack in the wall of hostility that had surrounded him. It was a voice of reason emerging from the heart of the opposition. While George was making his courageous call, the HOA board was drafting a letter. Pushed by Carol and fueled by their collective indignation, they authorized their law firm to send a cease and desist notice to the Oakhaven Heritage Trust. It was a masterpiece of legal bluster, accusing Arthur of illegal seizure of community assets, intimidation, and demanding he immediately remove his signs and restore the HOA's access, or face a lawsuit that would seek millions in damages. The letter was a formal declaration of war, based entirely on a foundation of lies. 2 days later, Arthur sat in George Maxwell's quiet, book-lined study. The threatening legal letter lay on the polished mahogany desk between them. George had read it, a small, grim smile on his face. "It's pure fantasy," he said, tapping a finger on the page. "They have no standing, no claim, no case. This is a scare tactic, and a poorly executed one at that." Arthur looked at the older man, a person who had every reason to side with his neighbors but had chosen to side with the truth instead. "Why are you helping me?" Arthur asked, the question direct and honest. George looked out the window toward the distant glint of the lake. "Because I've seen what happens when people like Carol Atherton are allowed to operate unchecked," he said, his voice firm. "They poison everything. This community needs to be reminded that a neighborhood is built on mutual respect, not on fences and bylaws. You've given them that reminder. Now, we're going to make sure they listen." Arthur nodded, a sense of partnership settling over him. He was no longer a lone man defending his land, he was part of an alliance for integrity. The HOA had chosen their path, a path of aggression and deceit. He and George would choose another. They would meet the lies not with anger, but with the simple, unyielding power of the truth. If you've ever felt like you were standing alone against a tide of misinformation, remember this: the truth is a powerful ally, and integrity will always find a partner in the quiet corners where it is most valued. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to our channel. There are more battles for the truth to be won, and more stories that need to be told.